what is the problem that change will address? If anyone has been paying attention the last few decades, you may have noticed that the health spending rate has grown very quickly in comparison to the economy itself. Now, the health expenditure is about 18% of gross domestic product, and as of 2016, for the very first time ever, we have broken through greater than $10,000 per person in healthcare expenditure per year. So to illustrate how we got to where we are currently with our healthcare economy, let's reflect on 1970. Back in 1970, we were spending about $356 per person. With adjustments for inflation, this equated to about $1,700 per person. Well, over the course of the next few decades, there was an explosion of medical knowledge. More treatments were becoming available, people were living longer, insurance premiums were rising, and as these things started to occur, people took notice. But what happened with this was that it became a very vicious cycle, and treatments became more expensive, insurance premiums are going up, and as insurance premiums are going up, there was more supply and demand, further driving up treatment costs. And it got to the point that people were becoming very restricted in their finances. Some couldn't afford their insurance, some couldn't afford preventative care, and some couldn't even afford to see their doctors. And as this continued to occur, the population was starting to get sicker, and not only that, but also at an earlier age. And with all the treatment advancements, people were living longer, but not necessarily healthier. If we continue down this route, the problem that we will start to see is that the healthier individuals will not be able to get the care that they need and fall victims to the debilitating health issues themselves. Now, when you're taking into consideration the $10,000 healthcare expenditure, you have to realize that that number is an average over the entire population. When you look at the actual breakdown of this, you'll notice that 50% of the individuals out there account for 97% of the healthcare cost. And more striking than this is that the top 5% account for 49% of the healthcare costs. Now, when you look at the statistics in the graph here, you may get a false sense of security that half of the population is actually doing quite well. The problem with healthcare expenditure is it does not take into account the expenses that population pays for preventative measures such as eating healthy and gym memberships. The current medical economy is really focused on treatments. When you look at the growing rates of such conditions as obesity and mental health illness, you will realize that it is only a matter of time before much of the population develops a chronic health condition. This graph depicts the projected growth of the population with chronic conditions through 2025. So this does beg the question, why is the population getting sicker? So when I reflected on this, I realized that much of it is like any other economic issue out there. It is a supply and demand problem. You see, here in America, the health system is based off the supply of doctors and the demands of the patients. And if you look at the last couple of decades, you will see that there has been a pretty static rate in which doctors are coming out of residency programs. Many medical schools are popping up around the country, but residency programs have not increased much for some time, especially for general practice. And what you'll notice as well is that many doctors are drifting towards specialty practices, so therefore no one is practicing general medicine as we were in the past, and that is where much of the prevention occurs. So how can we illustrate what we're talking about here? Well, think about the United States from many decades ago, maybe even centuries ago, when the population was much smaller than it is now. Back at that time, doctors could be doctors. We could make house calls. We could build meaningful relationships with patients. We had plenty of time to care for the population in the ways we felt that we should. During the baby boomer era in the mid-1900s, there was more industrialization, and the population was growing at a faster rate, both in the agricultural regions and especially in the urban areas. People were also living longer due to advancement in treatments, but this was okay because in that time, doctors could still be doctors. Medicare kicked in the 1960s, and with government funding, we were training more physicians, and we were still able to care for the population, even though we were caring for more patients than we were in the past. As the industrialization progressed during the turn of the millennia, the population growth rate continued to climb in the United States and across the world. The population's health and preventative metrics was getting worse. As a reaction, the government started the process of creating quality metrics that would ultimately push doctors to put an emphasis on documentation over patient care. And it got to the point that doctors started to take notice. We were thinking, what's going on here? Our clinics are getting much more crowded than they used to in the past, and now we have all these things we have to do. But hey, we can keep up with this. We'll just spend more time at work and squeeze in more patients. Maybe we'll even cut out some of the social talk we were so used to in the past. So So during the start of the 21st century, as industrialization was continuing to accelerate, and with that the growth of the population, it got to the point where doctors became literally drowned in a sea of patients. And with the third-party payer system, documentation, and insurance barriers, there arose issues that we could not control, and we could no longer care for patients in the ways we wish we could. So in 2013, there was an article published called The $1 Million Mistake of Becoming a Doctor. Now this was an issue that was already recognized by the medical community over the course of the last decade at the very least. What we noticed was that many doctors were deciding to leave the general medical profession. Some were retiring early, some were going into subspecialties. Many people who would have otherwise become doctors were not even starting the process to begin with. So the effect of this was that there was a decrease in delayed access to primary care and testing. Patients were turning to ERs and urgent care centers to receive care that they once received in the outpatient setting. This led to freestanding ERs and urgent care centers popping up all around the nation. This also led to the rise of spending in the acute care setting, which is much more expensive and contributed greatly to the increased healthcare expenditure noticed over the last few decades. So where exactly do I come in? Well, in 2013, I was finishing internal medicine residency training in Jacksonville, Florida. I had always been passionate about prevention, but realized the obstacles of outpatient primary care would not give me the time to care for patients in the way that I wanted to. So I decided to practice as a hospitalist. You see, as a hospitalist doctor, I'm not tied down to a schedule for seeing patients. I could spend all the time that I needed to help my patients, and I felt that when individuals come to the hospital, they were quite ill, and because of the suffering they were feeling, there would be a window of opportunity to help them change their behaviors and improve their long-term health. However, I came to realize within the first couple of years of practice that there were many barriers that we were dealing with here. Many of the patients coming to the hospital were simply those patients that did not have the resources to improve their health. And many of the individuals who could not afford insurance but would otherwise pay for things were deciding not to come to the hospital, even if they were quite ill. And I was seeing on average about 16 to 20 patients per day, and one of the biggest things that I recognized is that I would be spending about 30% of my time having the same conversation with individual patients on any given day. And I realized that this was a complete waste of time. You see, if we have an issue with supply and demand, then we are having a complete burn of our most precious commodity, time. Having the same conversations in a one-on-one setting is completely inefficient, so in the way that we are going, one-on-one care will fail to meet the needs and improve the health of the population. So I became quite frustrated with the way that things were occurring, but I refused to give in. I refused to have that learned helplessness that many in the healthcare system were feeling. So I thought a great deal about the problem, and when I came to the conclusion that one-on-one care is simply not the way to go, inspiration sparked like a flipped-on light bulb. Why are we doing things in a one-on-one care setting that we can otherwise do in groups? As I started navigating the factors behind the problem and the solution, I came up with a garden allegory to explain the principles that would be the foundation of change. So imagine the world out there is like a garden. Every garden has its gardener and its plants. The gardener is like the doctor and the plants are his patients. Well, the gardener waters each plant with his knowledge and skill, and the soil represents the health of the plant, which has to be fed to stay well. In the beginning of the garden, there were not many plants around. The gardener therefore could spend all the time needed to water the plants and provide the necessary care to keep the plant healthy and reach its potential. He could even use his single method watering pot to water each plant individually. However, what happens as the garden grows? The patient and skilled gardener would find a way to adapt to keep up. Instead of using a watering pot with its limited capacity, he might switch over to a hose. As the demand and number of the plants in the garden grows, it can start to overwhelm even the most adept gardener. In order to keep up, the adept gardener may hire other help to tend to the garden. However, it's difficult to gauge the quality of care you receive. You could be fortunate enough to build a team that runs smoothly because everyone knows their roles and carries them out diligently. Unless a better system is created to manage the garden, the maximum potential for every plant will be limited. Because of the garden's size, the gardener must tend to sicker plants and allow the garden hands to manage the healthier plants. The problem is, if the garden hand does not have an equal set of skills, these once healthy plants will start to become less flourishing. The gardener himself does not have the time to appropriately water his plants. Beyond that are many external forces that we cannot control, like moles and circling birds and parasites and weeds that all leach all the natural nutrients away and take away the time from the gardener as well as the water. The garden may become unsalvageable, taken over by weeds which leach all the nutrients and water away from other plants in the garden. If the gardener keeps to a single watering pot method, paying attention to the individual plant, the rest of the garden will get out of hand. Without the necessary water, the weeds will overtake the garden. Some gardeners may decide to limit their garden, like we do in concierge or direct access medicine. They focus their efforts and achieve immense potential from the select few patients in their garden. However, unless they decide to do something else beneficial for the garden with their freed up time, the problem that plagued it will continue. If the individual watering method continues with an ever-growing garden with a static or even decreasing number of gardeners, the garden will eventually die. So what is the solution to keep up with the demands of the growing garden? Well, if the water we give is the same, then why must the gardener be limited to a watering pot? Why can't we instead create a watering system, disseminate the necessary knowledge like a teacher does with their students? The methodology of change is based on the foundation that we give every plant the same water, which is our knowledge of the body of medicine. So the real-life watering system of change begins here, speaking with communities. So what are some of the things that you can have with change? Well, we can give topic-specific lunch and learns, create programs and talks to discuss mental health, which is really a core driver for our overall health and a major focus of change. We can create mentorship programs which work on character development and fosters true prevention by delivering education on the fundamental principles of physical and mental health. One of the main targets are our youth. The best prevention is to teach the right approach to life before behaviors and habits are ingrained in everything that we do. After all, as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if you would listen to Einstein, then you must realize as he did that problems cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them. And if we do things right, we can interrupt the toppling dominoes that threaten to spread and destroy us from within. Because if we have the right kind of help and work together as a community and keep ourselves motivated with purpose and keep our minds inspired through education, we all can change. And at the Change Providers, our business motto is that when we invest in people, we can change the world. Can you see this reality?